Hello, I'm Kirstyn.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
The scene is set. A picket white fence surrounds a perfectly even green expanse. A dense, solid mat stretching from corner to corner. One height, one shade. Perfection, right? Along the edges of the fences, something is occurring, though. The green alien mat has escaped its borders, and it creeps quickly and powerfully toward the unsuspecting prairies, where soon they too will appear just as perfect. All right. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to our second episode of the Anthropocene.
Hello.
All right. So today we're going to talk about something interesting, potentially controversial, and hopefully pot stirring, if that's even a verb.
Hopefully controversial.
Usually we will focus on one specific species in this, but today we have kind of a general overview of an issue and then a specific case study. It's going to be a little hard to stay biased on this one, maybe, but let's see what we can do. This organism is especially interesting as an invasive species topic because not only have we purposely introduced it, which has happened for many species, but we continue to maintain it as best as we possibly can. So today, the mystery organism, if you guys haven't already guessed it, is lawn grass.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of different species and a lot of different cases worldwide, but let's get started by introducing our guest for today. First, what is grass, right? All grasses are in the Poaceae family. I think that's right. Yes. All grasses are in the Poaceae family, which is one of the most abundant plant families on Earth. Now, this includes everything from lawn grass to even food crops like wheat. So they're special because each seed only produces one leaf and they're totally herbaceous. So they don't have any plant material or any woody plant material like a shrub or a tree. And they're annual plants.
Monocots.
Monocots, exactly. They are annuals, meaning they completely die out, or most of them are annuals, that they die out and then they're replaced by their seeds. Did you know that bamboo and corn are technically grasses? Because I actually didn't know that.
I should probably look this up and verify this immediately after I make this claim, but isn't like a palm tree a monocot
I think we'd have to
also?
check that as well. But yeah, there's
I'm
like
looking it
a
up right now because I might be just talking out of my butt.
right. So there's a range of things that are considered grasses that I didn't even consider as grasses before I started doing research for this episode. So that was pretty interesting. Little fun fact about bamboo too, it is the tallest and fastest growing grass species. So it can grow actually 40 millimeters or an inch and a half in an hour under ideal conditions, which is absolutely wild.
That is insane, but I don't want to take away from that insane fact. But yes, palm trees are in fact monocots. So
Okay,
they are not trees.
there we go. So everybody's learning something new today. All right. So then, talking specifically about lawn grass, we can actually divide them into two groups. We get cool and warm season grasses. So, as you can imagine, cool season grasses grow in places that are temperate and tend to have seasonality, and they live in colder climates. And then warm season grasses are going to be in hotter places and drier places. If ever anybody here is interested, I came across a paper from Lakshman Day, 2017, in the show notes that really breaks down all types of lawn grasses, where they grow, what they're good for. So if anybody's doing some kind of urban studies project, this would be a super good paper for you. So I'm not going to go through the huge list and all of the scientific names, but some cool season grasses are alkali grass, annual bluegrass, Canada bluegrass, colonial bentgrass, creeping bentgrass, fine fescus, Kentucky bluegrass, and it keeps going on. And then we have warm season grasses is Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, blue grama, buffalo grass. It keeps going. So there's a lot of different types of grasses in the world. And then you can imagine that in each of these species too, there's some kind of variance as well. So if you're interested, that paper is there for you to dive right into all the different grass types.
Um, for reference, as far as my background goes, I do have a little bit of a background in landscaping. If you guys are wondering what type of grass we typically have up in the northern states or Midwest and things like that, we typically have Kentucky Bluegrass and different species of fescues. And I think down south, they typically have Bermuda grass and I believe zoysia grass, but I wouldn't quote me on that. It's just different species of not necessarily native grasses that are easily mowed and kept at low areas. And obviously they're kept in different areas because they require different or they're in entirely different climates and soil types and things like that. So I think a lot of people have um, that general misunderstanding that all lawn grasses are one species of grass when typically there's a pretty big variance. So that's a good point to bring up, I think.
Right, for sure. And a little bit of a spoiler alert is with time, if you do start to do some research, you'll see that there is a few more different types of grasses being used in different places, which is a good thing because having one or two or three types of grasses and trying to have them across all kinds of climate variants and different soils, you can imagine that that's really difficult for the upkeep. So, um, all over the place we have different types, but for sure there is a bit of a problem with there being one type of grass in a lot of different areas, which we're going to dive into a little bit more here soon. So let's talk a little bit about lawn grass and its history and the role in our lives in the ecosystem. So lawns as a thing, obviously lawn grass has been around kind of forever, but lawns as a thing mainly started in Europe. You would have had it a lot in France. Now, it was something that only the rich could have. This was a status symbol way back in the day because lawns were upkeep. You had to water them, you had to have somebody to clean it up for you. So we're talking way back like pre 1600s here that lawns started to be a thing, but it's a very totally a status symbol here. And then we fast forward a long while, and times change and people in middle and even lower classes, they get a bit more free time, a little bit more property, and lawns become more and more popular. And soon, even in the 50s, in the 30s, you couldn't even sell a home without a nice lawn in the front of it, right? So for us, it's such a normal thing, but back way in the day, it wasn't wasn't the idea. So now too, we get to the point where there's even community standards around how your lawn needs to look, right? And spoiler alert, it's green, it's short, weedless, and totally void of biodiversity. All
And
right.
covered in chemicals and fertilizers.
Yes, it is. There's a lot of maintenance that goes into it. So just for the general lawn grass, we're going to play a little bit of games of pros and cons. I'm going to talk about each of those. And then afterwards, we're going to look at a specific as an invasive species. So just bear with me, everybody. I know you're waiting for that. But so we can all agree that a lawn is better than concrete, right? It still produces oxygen, it still cycles carbon, and it's natural as we see it, at least. It's better than a huge slab of concrete or rocks in the front of your driveway, right? Everybody would rather see a lawn in a park than to see a parkade, right? So there's that. Then to some extent, lawns and grasses, they do prevent erosion, maybe not to the same extent as trees, but you do have the roots that hold on to the soil and they keep it there, and they control dust. So all the dust that comes by when all these cars are driving by, it does settle down in the grass and it stays there, right? You also get a little bit of prevention of runoff because it soaks up the water. And I have seen that it can cool off an area, though the studies, which will be in the show notes, there don't do it as much as trees and shrubs, but there is still a little bit of a cooling effect compared to, again, a tarmac road or something. And then the interesting one is lawns have a lot of social and cultural importance, right? So sports, if you want to go play football or soccer, football, any of those kinds of things, you need a nice big green space with lawn grass. You want to enjoy a picnic in your backyard, play with your kids. And then just also the culture aspect of people like to tend to their lawn and they think it's, they enjoy going out and making their garden look good. Not all of us. Some of us hate mowing the lawn for sure. And then this one is kind of weird because I'm not sure if it's a pro or a con, but it is a multi-billion dollar industry. So I'm not sure where you would put that one, Nicholas.
Pretty low on my anything that's industrialized and you know that much of a money sink that could be used for I don't know something that actually makes a difference in the world. That's always my 2 cents on those kind of things. I think the other thing too that I would assume that lawns would be more beneficial than like a concrete thing. You talked about runoff, but I think infiltration and absorption of excess nutrients is probably a pretty big thing of that. I know I have a little bit of a background because of herbicide licensing and things like that. So the shorter grasses are obviously not as ideal as native grasses or native plants and some things of that nature. However, as opposed to concrete with zero infiltration and 100% runoff, obviously it's an advantage to the absorption of any sort of chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, or even salt application for roads and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a super great point to add. Thank you. Essentially, yeah, at the end of the day, lawns look nice, maybe. That's a controversial debate for maybe later. And then they do help with these different things. And of course, in a park with your kids, you want them to have a lawn instead. On that note, though, we should go ahead and look at why it's not so good. So lawns they lower diversity. It is a monoculture, right? Now, if anybody's not familiar with what monoculture means, it's just all of the same species, right? So this really harms biodiversity and other insects. You can see paper Smith et al. 2015, and they tried a couple different treatments to take a look at lawn grass or lawn grass with native plants and how much they were mowing it down as well. And super mowed down flat grasses just totally limited the insect population, for example. So not only is it making that it's a monoculture in plants, but there's less things that can live there. It is kind of in a way common sense because you have one type of plant, there's only a certain amount of things that can eat or live and reproduce in that. So monocultures are bad. So this in a sense is invasive just in this general sense that it's taking a whole area completely over instead of the native plants that could be there. Even if it's a native grass, in nature, you're still going to have some clovers or some weeds popping out there. But we are purposely creating this space of invasion, essentially. So there's that.
I also imagine that the fact that lawns are continuously mowed to prevent them from going to seed or flower or anything like that. Grasses do flower, by the way. That obviously is not really offering any sort of benefit to any sort of insects or things like that. More or less, you're just getting a subpar habitat without any food sources or reproductivity or anything like that. So the fact that lawns are mowed is even more of a detriment to their actual ecological importance.
Right, exactly. Like we mentioned earlier, that grain crops like wheat and barley, those things are grasses, and you only get the food once they go to seed. They grow really tall, and then the seeds at the top is what we eat, right? And so, yeah, we keep the lawns mowed down totally so that they don't seed because it looks ugly, and they're all it to people supposedly. And then, yeah, you get no food source from it. So that is kind of the bad thing in the monoculture sense, right? Another thing is a massive use of water, especially in dry climates, but even in places where it rains quite a bit, it is just terrible and it's unsustainable. I don't even have to quote like one particular paper. If anybody goes onto Google Scholar and looks up water use lawns, everything is going and it's not a sustainable use. We are using way too much water. There's even some places that lawns use more water than food crops. So this is a huge bad one for us. So not only are we taking up all this space, but especially because a ton of these grasses are non-native, or because a certain grass is picked because of the way that it looks, but it needs more water than that space does. So that is a huge one.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is if you have a lawn, which I'm sure many of you listening do, If you're going to water it for upkeep or just to appease the HOA or wherever you live, water early in the morning or later in the evening when the sun is not up, because that's going to decrease evaporation and it's going to conserve a lot of water usage. And that evapotranspiration isn't going to be as aggressive as it would be if you were to water in midday. So the people who have their sprinklers out in the front of their yards in the middle of summer, in the middle of the day, I'd like to take a moment here to say a big and wholehearty fuck you.
Fuck you.
Okay, fuck you. How's that?
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Hey, fuck you!
Yes! Yes! Fuck you too!
And please don't do that.
Right. And we don't want to, cause too many problems for people that have lawns. Like, we don't want people to feel like terrible, because there's a lot of cultural things around that. There's a ton of regulations, but we're here to tell you about some of the bad things. And there are going to be some pointers for what you can do. The big one being, don't water your lawn in the middle of the day in the heat, as Nicholas just said.
I might be playing the devil's advocate a little bit early, but it might not be as much of an act as some other episodes.
Right. This one is hard to really look at the positives on it. Now, another thing that maybe people don't think about as much is every time we're mowing down all of this biomass, if you don't have a compost, all of this material goes to the landfill. So we're getting a ton of material mowed up and taken to landfills, which is not good either, because if they're not in compost, they biodegrade in a anoxic environment, which means there's no oxygen, and they release a lot of harmful gases. So also not good. As well, speaking of gases, I was looking up, and the EPA in the United States actually says that lawn equipment, like a mower, emits up to 11 times the pollution as cars. So all the people out mowing and weed whacking and all this stuff, it's in some areas it's a lot.
Yeah, to expand upon that a little bit, it's the 2-cycle engine, because it bypasses. It doesn't necessarily have the same sort of. It doesn't process fuel in the same way as like a traditional car engine does. So you get a significant amount more of these hazardous chemicals in the exhaust, which is why those types of engines are only allowed for use in the lawn care industry. I will put the statistic in the show notes, but it's something around if you run a backpack blower for an hour, it's the same as driving like a large pickup truck for like 600 miles or something ridiculous like that. So, yeah, that's also something to consider, is like the upkeep of lawns is just exceptionally detrimental as well.
Well, and like I said, it's so interesting because a lot of our episodes in the future are going to be us kind of talking about getting rid of an invasive species. But right now we're talking about all the ways that we're trying to maintain it as a society. So that's why I wanted to start with this one, even if it's a little bit off from what we're going to be doing in the future. The other lawn care problem is pesticides and herbicides that are used to keep, mostly herbicides that are used to keep other weeds and stuff off of the lawn. Now, these can harm wildlife and us and even our pets. So there's a paper from Knapp et al. In 2013 that they actually detected large quantities of herbicides in the urine of pet dogs. So these dogs are absorbing these pesticides and herbicides, herbicides into their body. So you're making your pet sick by using a lot of herbicides. And then another study from the EPA again was saying that right after spraying your lawn, you're actually tracking in a bunch of that into their homes. And they were detecting significant levels of dangerous chemicals in the house from, the kids going out, rolling in the grass and bringing it inside. So just something to make you maybe second guess a little bit how much herbicide and pesticide you're using on your lawn. Now, we totally, again, understand if you're being yelled at by your neighbors because you have weeds, but just something to think about.
As someone who has to study extensively for herbicide application licensing exams, you learn a thing or two about lawn care as well, because obviously that's one of the main uses for them. And I would just say that lawn care herbicide application is based on a broadcast application method, which means that the lawns are sprayed uniformly via boom sprays, which basically means that every single leaf and everything is covered by a selective herbicide that only affects dicots, which are, everything but grasses, sedges, rushes, things like that. So your multi-leaved plants and weeds that are affected by this herbicide, but it's not necessarily cost effective or efficient to spray each and every individual plant. In restoration management, it's called spot spraying, and we spray the plants we want to remove directly. However, in lawn care methods, it's that broadcast application. So you are uniformly putting herbicide everywhere during lawn care. So anything that gets in there, your dog when it nibbles on grass, you just walking through the grass after application, some of the residuals on certain herbicides that are sprayed can be hours or even days afterwards. Sorry, am I getting ahead of you?
No. I was just gonna say your kid when they nibble on the grass, like if we're being realistic, your dog or your kid.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, that's perfect. It's all the things you're adding are super great. Yeah. So, and then another huge problem with relation to this, which is more of like a cultural societal thing, which I guess, I don't know if I should be getting into this, but there's all these town and community rules around how your lawn has to look. So I see all the time as an anecdote, people on Twitter who are trying, and they're not just leaving their lawns like crazy growing, but they, try to section off a little piece and leave it longer or have bigger shrubs and things. And people are bothered by this. So in order for us to fix this problem, which we'll talk more about kind of at the end, is there has to be a whole, it's not even a difficult thing to manage, but there has to be a whole cultural shift around this. So that's interesting.
So can we talk about leaves for a second?
Oh, we can talk about leaves. So also speaking about lawn care and issues with altering the natural environment, which is essentially what we're looking at in an invasive species podcast. I know this isn't a landscaping podcast, but landscaping is invasion. Anyway, total side note. Yes. So the other thing that is a huge part of some of these regulations or just people wanting to maintain their lawns is raking and mulching up leaves from places. So of course, I mean, this growing up as a kid, it was the fall comes and you go out and you rake all the leaves and throw them in a pile and jump on them and put them in bags, right? But we're starting to see more and more with more studies that this is super detrimental to the environment. So not only just in the way that we take all these leaves and throw them in the landfill, causing the same problems mentioned as earlier, but there's a ton of different things that are probably starting to hibernate or have laid their eggs in these leaves. So different types of amphibians, reptiles, insects. And even too, after the snow falls, there might even be mammals that, are using part of these leaves as a way to stay warm. So this is also a huge issue. And a lot of people want to leave their leaves there because leave their leaves there, but they're not allowed, right? Or people just don't even think about it. Is there something else you can add to this, Nicholas, with all your landscaping history?
So essentially the reasoning behind leaves is one, it's aesthetically pleasing, to the people who desire a nice green lawn under that in the fall. But second fold is that during the fall, there's still quite a long overlap of time where the plants will drop the trees will drop their leaves. And this can actually kill off and suffocate out the grass. When you typically go into a forest, if it's not like a large open oak savanna, there's not that many like grass species. And if they are, they're specifically they're going to be your bottle brush grasses and things like that are specifically have evolved to grow effectively in low light environments, whereas your lawn is typically designed to grow in full sun. So when the leaves cover that, it does kill off the growing portion of the plant as well as the rhizomes underneath the soil, and you get dead spots. So depending on how many leaves you have in your adjacent woodlands or things like that, it can kill off your lawn. So there's a practical reason for doing it, not just an aesthetic reason. But I would say that the antithesis of that is the biota that utilize that and the nutrients that come from that leaf fall are vital to sustaining the ecosystems. So forests are dependent on that additional organic matter that falls from their leaves.
Right. Yeah. So if you can leave your leaves, give it a try. I'm always really surprised by people They get so bothered by leaves in their place. As a little side anecdote, here in Ecuador, my aunt, the aunt of my husband, she has this beautiful garden, and her neighbor beside her literally has concrete. The whole thing is a concrete slab. And when her leaves fall over, they come and they complain and they have to cut back the leaves because there's like 4 or 5 leaves that have come down from their beautiful like guava tree, or they have a fig tree that's just beautiful and the birds love it, and like 4 or 5 leaves fall into the neighbor's yard and they have to cut it back. It's just, we're very detached from nature, I feel like. So if you can leave your leaves, try it. Leave your leaves
Believe it.
2021.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then for the last point, the focus for us usually here is most of the time these grasses are not native. So in North America, a lot of these are brought over from Europe, from different places. I was reading a paper, which will be in the show notes. I'll put a note which one it is, that in China too, they bring in like 20,000 tons of grass, of non-native grasses every year. It's all over the world that we're bringing in non-native grasses. And so then where we're going to get into now is it's not only that these non-native grasses are in our lawn and we're keeping them out, but they are starting to escape, right? So not just even talking about how much your lawn sucks, but how much that they're getting into these natural places and they're becoming invasive. So this is that's our general overview of lawns. And now just to get a little more specific, we can talk about a specific case study for Kentucky Bluegrass, which is Poa pratensis. And we're going to be focusing on it in the northern Great Plains. So right after the break, we're going to get into that a little bit more.
Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And we're back.
All right, so now let's get into a bit of a case study. We already talked to you about how much your lawn sucks, but let's look at lawn grass as an actual invasive species so that we kind of end up fulfilling our objective here. So again, we are talking about Kentucky bluegrass today, Poa pratensis, which was actually introduced into the United States and Canada in the 1600s. So this has been around for a long time. The main paper that I used to look at this was by De Keyser et al. 2015. So they did a really awesome review on this species and looked at a bunch of cases. And it's a really great paper if you want to look at it. It has a really cool history about the introduction as well. We're just going to dip our toes into what they looked at. So the name of the paper is Invasion in the Northern Great Plains, a story of rapid dominance in an endangered ecosystem. Now, this, of course, is focused in the Northern Great Plains, which is in the eastern kind of north of the United States and the southern parts of Canada there, for anybody that's not familiar. Also got a bunch of awesome information from the IUCN invasive species database. There's also a link to that in the show notes. If you guys are interested, it's a super great site as well. So what is it like in its native habitat? It's a super successful and productive grass species and often quite dominant.
Are you in charge here?
Yes, I
Nope.
am.
Wrong. I'm in charge.
Is
Me.
Major
I'm in charge.
It was used for pastures and lawns in the first place because it creates this really nice thick mat of grass and it grows really quickly. Now, the other positive for it is it starts growing really early in spring and carries into the late fall. So not only is it a productive grass throughout the year, is compared to some other species, it grows sooner and later. So that's especially helpful if you have livestock, of course, and it's if you want a pretty lawn. So it's used worldwide because it creates a really nice thick mat, and it was actually already spread throughout Europe before it was even properly described. It was pasture grass, lawn grass, all of that.
I was thinking also that a lot of invasive grasses, not necessarily just lawn grasses, but we'll be discussing some of them more in the future, but many species were actually introduced specifically for grazing because they grew in areas that our native grasses didn't typically do well in.
Right, or they just didn't grow as quickly and take heavy grazing as much. Just kind of a bit of a side note is something that we do that doesn't really mimic the natural system is we keep like cattle, for example, in one space for a long period of time unless there's a huge range. So there's a lot of pressure put on that grass where native grasses are used to a herd that kind of comes through and munches and moves on. So unless you use rotational grazing, which is moving your cattle from one pasture to another or have a huge property, the native grasses can't handle that constant pressure, whereas these other ones could. Exactly. So yes, this is a really long history of these. Where is it from? It's actually native to temperate Eurasia. So this one is a cool season grass. So that's why you find it in a lot of these temperate areas in Canada and the US. And it is currently invasive in Antarctica, Canada, the Falkland Islands, French Southern Territories, Mexico, New Zealand, St. Helena, South Africa, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands, and the United States. So it's a pretty good list. And this is just Kentucky Bluegrass, by the way. This is not including all the other ones.
So I noticed you said Antarctica on there. Now, Man, I'm kind of at a loss for words here because that is very, very surprising to me. I would imagine that it wasn't an intentional colonization, that it came from just, I don't know, seeds. Do you have any more information on that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Unfortunately, I didn't get too deep into this one, but there is actually a lot of places where it was accidental introduction as well. So not only kind of in the next one, how was it introduced? Not only was it brought in for long grasses in a lot of places, but because it grows into this nice tall grass that you can use as hay, it's used as packaging in boats and stuff. It was used as hay. It was used to help keep things warm. Maybe they were using it in bedding. So I would assume in early exploration of Antarctica, that's how it happened. I should try to find a paper and put it in the show notes. Sorry that I didn't dive deeper into that, guys, but it should be a pretty interesting topic.
I mean, I personally think that that's a fair enough conclusion to draw, is that I had no idea that it was used for packing and things of that nature. So, I mean, if you're shipping people and supplies out to Antarctica and you're using that for insulation or packing materials, then yeah, of course you're going to have seeds. You're basically drying out the grasses and allowing the seeds to go through that natural cooling period that they need to germinate. So, yeah, we might look into that a little bit more, and if we find anything, we'll put it into the show notes. But I think that's probably a fair assumption.
Right. Yeah, pretty wild, but it's super widely spread and it's really messing things up. So, just a little bit more on how it was introduced into the USA for the Great Plains region. Again, it was brought in specifically by some of the first people that colonized to create lawns because they want this really beautiful lawn grass, just like they had in their home country. It's like Poa pretensis, more like Poa pretentious.
Ha!
Terrible. I'm sorry. All right. So that's the main idea, right? So then in the Northern Great Plains, it seems like it started to encroach into natural areas as early as the 1800s. And it quickly became classified as a weed in many places. And it spread and it spread and it spread because it is this really amazing productive grass. So why is this a big deal? Because in these prairies, these are already super endangered ecosystems. So not only has a huge amount of this been converted into farmland, into settlements, those kind of things, but these places are already in a lot of trouble. And then we get this invasive species that comes through here and it spatially competes, right? So not only is it fighting the other plants, but it creates this really thick mat and just doesn't let anything else grow. So what are the main issues with, like, what is the problem here? So same idea as what we talked about in the lawns, you're reducing the overall biodiversity as it takes over. So as you get a higher percentage of Kentucky bluegrass, there's only so much space in a prairie because nothing grows, vertically. So you're getting less percentage of other things. Kentucky bluegrass is for sure replacing native plants. Before 1990, bluegrass wasn't even found in the site studied in the paper. And then by 2009, it made up 84% of the annual production. So in just a short amount of time, it was huge.
One of the big things too with invasive grasses, why they become such a massive problem is because they spread through rhizomes. So essentially, they multiply themselves through the roots in the soil, and then they put up shoots from those roots, on top of the additional, usually high quantities of seeds that each of the grasses produce. That doesn't just prevent things from growing by suffocating out, light and things like that. It does occupy the soil where a lot of these native species would grow, making it significantly more difficult for their management.
Exactly. Yeah. And we'll get a little bit more into how we try to manage and why it's so difficult to manage that in just a sec. But yeah, the problem is it's doing this, it's taking up these spaces. We're getting a huge loss of biodiversity, and a loss of biodiversity in many systems is a problem not only because of the intrinsic value of keeping all of our native species, but having this grass take over. So other than just the intrinsic value of losing biodiversity and losing all of our native species, and also harming other organisms that feed on these native species, lower biodiversity in general lowers the system's ability to deal with stress. So having variety helps a system to be able to sustain itself better. So for example, blue grama, this is a native grass, and it's drought tolerant. So if there's a big drought, it can make up for some of the loss of productivity when there isn't as much precipitation. But if the Kentucky bluegrass has come through and wipes most of that out, and it doesn't do very well in drought, then you're losing overall productivity, which is bad for any of the organisms that come through and they depend on these grasses.
And also, just as a side note, blue grandma is a grass and not to be confused with blue grandma, who is the elderly mother of the Smurfs.
Shut up!
Thank you for that, Nicholas. That was very educational.
You're so welcome.
All right. So in general, higher biodiversity helps to stabilize a system, right? Just a quick little ecology theory note that I think is interesting is there's a little bit of a debate around where this point is, like how much biodiversity is necessary for things to be, for a stability of an ecosystem. And this is called redundancy. So at some point in theory, you get enough species that having more doesn't do anything. But either way, at the end of the day, it's pretty well accepted that monocultures and low diversity are harmful. So this is why we're starting to do things like more intercropping. And this is even in plants or in farms, where we grow things. And it's instead of growing a huge field of one kind of crop, you grow some of a crop and then another line, you grow another one. So this helps that the system is more stable. Also, as a farmer, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? If you get some kind of disease that comes through and wipes out your corn, but you also have a line of canola there, then you have a little bit of an advantage. And then also too, they're not jumping between, like there might be a bit of a barrier of a disease that's affecting one plant and not the other. So at the end of the day, monocultures are bad, and these grasses are coming through and they're creating a monoculture in these super sensitive habitats. So this is why this is a really bad thing.
And I would also say that additionally, monoculture kind of breeds tolerance to herbicides, diseases, and things like that. So you're getting these invasive species that, because they're so monoculture and things like that, they're more tolerant of possible treatments, and they're becoming more difficult to treat. So that's also an effect of having like a massive monoculture thing.
Why is it such a good invasive? What does Kentucky bluegrass have that makes it like the bad kid on the block?
Ooh, tough guy.
So it's super competitive. It can invade even really disturbed areas. In this paper, they had anecdotes of it coming through like salt licks and places that had been disturbed in some way. So even if there's some kind of anthropogenic disturbance that comes through, this is one of the first colonizers. So it gets in there and establishes before native plants get a chance to. And then as well, from the 1930s, because this grass was so popular, they actually began to engineer thousands of varieties of this. So at first, obviously, just through selective breeding, and then we get into the point where we're doing genetically modified grasses. So this makes it even more desirable and even more competitive. So Kentucky bluegrass doesn't do very well with drought, but we have more drought-resistant bluegrass now, which makes it even better at invading spaces.
And you're gonna see that with most ornamentals and a lot of agricultural varieties of things. Naturally, you don't find these fruiting trees or anything like that fruiting in that capacity. You don't find these species that are able to tolerate more dry or wet conditions, and it's all just thanks to this genetic modification and selective breeding, which in a lot of cases is not necessarily a bad thing. However, in the case of engineering these invasive grasses, you can make them so that they can establish in a wider variety of areas and be more effective.
Right. Exactly. And just to give you guys some numbers on how quickly it just established in a study in North Dakota, they took 28 different native grassland sites, and 22 out of the 28 of these sites from 1984 later till 2007 had a frequency of 35% bluegrass across all of these places. And then in another study on a rangeland site, in just 20 years, there went from being zero bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, to it being the most abundant species. So I know 20 years sounds like a quote unquote kind of long time, but if you're looking at it over ecological communities and that kind of stuff, it's super fast.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Awesome. So the other thing that makes it such a good invasive is how much we love it. Kentucky bluegrass is the largest contributor to the $57.9 billion turfgrass industry in North America. Yes. And then as well, just another note, climate change is adding time into the fall in growing season, which is when this grass is most productive, giving it an even higher advantage. And as well, along the lines of climate change, these species actually love higher CO2, so they're growing even better. And a lot of native species, they don't do as much of their growing in the fall, and they're not as good at as good at growing in high levels of CO2. So this grass is just getting all of the things that it wants. It's just like a super happy fat kid with cake here.
As someone who has to do a lot of excessive management on escaped bluegrass and things of that nature, the largest problem I notice is that they have such a extended growing period in the fall that come spring when I'm doing management, it seems like they're months ahead of the growing of any other species. And also a lot of the, at least in the Midwest, a lot of our native grass species don't really start growing until pretty late in the summer. So these taller grasses that would probably suffocate them out are not necessarily able to compete as well because they're not growing in that same period. So by extending that period of the grass, it's just making it more detrimental. They're being more able to kind of escape and get advantages on those native species. And yeah, obviously it's just a positive feedback loop with negative results.
Right. Yeah. Something that is a reoccurring theme with invasive species is that they're not on the same, like, quote unquote, schedule as everybody else. So, all of these things in a forest, in a prairie that are native there have evolved together in some way. So, they compete in some way and they also don't compete in other ways. And, they use different niches. And then an invasive comes in a relatively short period of time and nothing has any chance to evolve with it. So yeah, you get these grasses that are already doing great because they had that head start in the fall as opposed to the other ones that all start later. So it was fine before. So that's like a really general problem with invasive species is they're just not on the same, it's like they get a head start sort of thing in a race. Last little point on the climate change sort of affecting things. Now, in North Dakota, precipitation in the last, I think it was the last 10 years they did this study. My apologies on the exact numbers, but the precipitation is 15 to 25% higher, which sounds great. However, the Kentucky bluegrass loves a moist prairie, and a lot of these native species are used to a bit drier, more well-drained soil. So there's just all the things that are checking the boxes to make it a happy little grass. So what is being done about this? This is always the sometimes happy, sometimes sad piece. So management, there's a bunch of different things that go into managing this. Now, I'm also going to let you go ahead after I mention all these things, Nicholas, and tell us what you've specifically done. A big one is burning. Now, if you guys are at all familiar with prescribed burning, this is something that happens in a lot of prairies anyway, where you go through and burn down grasses and shrubs because a lot of these systems are used to being burned. But you can burn down really hard the bluegrass, and this is done, but it has to be repeated over several years and usually needs to be done in a combination with something because, like Nicholas mentioned earlier, they grow from their rhizomes. So this part of the plant is actually under the soil, and if it doesn't get burned or treated properly, it just grows right back after a fire. So a lot of the combinations are to use other chemicals. So we have glycophosphate, imidazopyr, and sulfomethylmetron methyl. Sorry, but these can also come and have native impacts on native species as well. Just what we were talking about with the lawns. If you just spray this all over the place, you're also hurting some of the native species. So lots of places are using a combo of this burning and putting chemicals and spraying, obviously, in just patches where there's more bluegrass. And then the idea is just to try to get this Kentucky bluegrass out and give a chance for the native species to go ahead. There was a really cool blog from the Prairie Ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, and they had a bunch of things about their treatment. So what they're doing is they're burning and or grazing with animals harder in the spring. So in this early growing season, like you said, Nicholas, that these grasses are established already. So they come into an area, they put cattle or sheep or goats, or they do their burning while this grass is really established. Try to break it down a little bit, and then these other grasses have a chance to come through. So just taking the treatment to a specific time, which is really interesting. Now, Chris Heiser was the person that wrote this blog, and they said something that I really liked and I wanted to share. Now, they said, this is quote, "When trying to manage for plant diversity in the face of pervasive species such as Kentucky bluegrass, it's more important to track plant diversity than to worry about how much territory the bluegrass occupies." Because the idea is just that they're trying to break down the mat a bit and let the other plants come through. Because if you look at over the whole plains, the percentage that's it's still, or not the percentage, but the area it covers, it still covers everywhere. But if you can break it down and get more native plants throughout that carpet or mat, then that's where we're winning. So the idea is just to try to reduce it to the point where the native plants can still thrive there. And obviously at some point try to get rid of it, but it is such an established and pervasive thing that it's going to be pretty difficult. Do you have something to add about your management strategies?
I could probably sit here and talk for a while, but I'll basically try and hit on the things that you just mentioned specifically. So when I do my management, I am pretty much centralized on herbicide mitigation, which basically means like, yes, I do use herbicide application in my management strategies. However, I try to mitigate that by introducing cultural and mechanical practices such as burning and cutting, like you mentioned. I sure do wish that I could put some goats out in my natural areas and have them graze in the spring. That sounds fantastic, but I don't think the public around here would take too kindly to that. So essentially, by burning, what you're doing is you're knocking back not only the non-native grasses, but a lot of the other non-native species that don't necessarily have deep root systems. Now, here in the Midwest and in a lot of places where there are grasslands and prairies and things of that nature, they have very, very deep root systems. And this is because historically fires would pass through these areas, and the deeper the root systems, the more energy and nutrients they're able to store, and they're able to tolerate the hotter fires and recover more quickly afterwards. So, as you would imagine, plants that are non-native to these areas have shallower root systems and are more susceptible to being burned below the surface because they don't necessarily need to be physically burned, but the heat in of itself is enough to kill off those rhizomes. On top of that, obviously cutting and things of that nature is reducing the overall presence of the grasses. And I think that that blog that you referenced just put it very eloquently, you're never ever going to get rid of all species of grass. Yes, there are grass selective herbicides, but when you're in a prairie, which is like a tall grass prairie, that's a grass dominant prairie, you're still going to have overspray and negative effects on the native plants that you have there. So herbicide is very difficult, and with grass you're not just spraying with dicots. You can spray on the foliage and use, if you're using a foliar spray, and typically we use glyphosate, and we can talk about how bad that is in another episode. But essentially it's a non-selective herbicide, so it will kill everything. However, it's much easier to spot spray a non-selective herbicide on a dicot where it's a larger plant. It's got mainly a taproot, and it's one singular plant versus a mat of rhizomes that have native plants integrated throughout. Herbicide is not necessarily the best management scheme for that. There are certain places where if you're trying to completely restart from the beginning, you can just till, mow, burn, and completely eradicate everything and then start from the ground up. But if you're trying to manage and use preventative management strategies, you're going to be using a combination of a bunch of different strategies. So the cultural practice being, of course, burning, the mechanical practice being mowing and cutting and things like that to prevent them from going to seed. And also just, of course, selective herbicide application where it is viable. So it's a massive process that is only exacerbated by the fact that grasses are very, very difficult species to treat. So I would say that probably the most aggressive and difficult invasives that I deal with are grasses, and specifically lawn grasses, being that my natural areas are often surrounded by walking paths and mowed areas and even people's lawns. It's one of the most detrimental species I have to my native flora. So yeah, I don't like lawns is the summarization of that entire tirade. So
Right. Long story short, you should maybe do a public poll on the goats, because I know, like in the city of Calgary and a few other places, they use goats as like big weed removal and grass removal, and people love it. They think it's great. I think it's hilarious.
the town that I am in vetoed our burns this year because they're afraid that the geese would come back and poop in their yards. For those of you who don't know, if you have a native plant community around a retention pond, it does prevent geese from coming out and grazing around there because they like being in an open area where they can see predators and feel safer. So if you burn that area, it's more likely that the geese are going to come out and poop. But obviously management strategies are necessary to burn. So we had to postpone our burning this year because we got 40 to 50 complaints from a single neighborhood saying that they didn't want goose poop in their yard. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they're not going to be too fond of goats, but hey, you know what? Maybe I should try.
That is unfortunate. This is why we're here, right? Like, we're trying to share all this information with the public. We're trying to, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people, biologists and conscious people listening, but we really hope there's some people out there that maybe had no idea about this. I mean, up until, I don't know, like 4 years ago, never thought about lawns in this way. So we're just trying to share that information. And I mean, education is key, right? That's all we can do for right now.
Absolutely. And I think that it's difficult for people to realize because, as you said in the very beginning, yes, it is a cultural practice that we practice, and it's something that is very difficult to shift because it's just set in our minds that lawns are clean, that looks good. I get people who look at the natural areas that I manage and they call them weeds. They say every single one of them is weeds. And I was like, if you want to go by definition, the only weeds in this picture are your yard. So
Right. Yeah, it's complicated. It's a process, but we're here step at a time, right? All right, so to sort of wrap things up a bit before we debate a little bit on this topic, which, spoiler alert, the debate round is not going to be that long today because we have pretty strong opinions about this. Let's be realistic. But there's some main takeaways here. And don't get me wrong, I love a nice picnic, and I love going to the park and enjoying like big open areas as well, especially because I grew up like that. So I'm not saying get rid of every piece of lawn ever, like especially a space that is used for football or American football. Like, you need some grass there, and that's okay. But we need to rethink the way that we see natural areas, just like Nicholas mentioned, like what we see as weeds and what we see as aesthetic. We need to slowly integrate that into our culture as well. I think Nicholas has something to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just hit the nail on the head right there when you said integrate. As a very specific example, our dog park, rather than being just monoculture grass, has intermittent native species spread throughout. We have various prairie systems throughout, which gives the dogs a little bit more of a kind of natural way to move about. But also, it just looks better than having just one big square fenced in lawn. We have these native species, these flowering species, and things like that. Now, the only caveat to a thing like that is there are many, many native species that are toxic to dogs. So if something like that is on your agenda, make sure that you always do your research and look at the species that you're going to plant and make sure that they are friendly if you're going to go for something that your dogs or your animals are going to be interacting with directly.
Right, exactly. So it's just about making a bit of a change. Now, just as a small anecdote, right after quarantine here, I came out and there's a really big metropolitan park by me called Parque Carolina in Quito. And the grass was so long and big, and there was a bunch of weeds because it hadn't been managed, and it was so beautiful. And I just didn't see why. Obviously, in the main area where there's the track and the football fields and those kind of things could be left open, but there's these spaces with lots of trees that are kind of on the outside, and I just couldn't see why we couldn't leave some longer grasses and some different species of grasses and some shrubs, because it was so nice, So that's my little anecdote as to, coming out from quarantine and seeing this and seeing that we could maybe have more of an integrated system. People are doing better landscaping now as well. I'm going to get into the good news in a sec. So some takeaways from the lawns. Lawns are harmful to biodiversity, to water. They're bad for climate change. They don't absorb carbon as much as some other things. And they become really successful and dangerous invasive species. It's not even just in the spaces where we're taking care of them. So we need to really change the way that we're landscaping and work on this integration. Now, the good news is, thankfully, things are progressing, maybe slowly, maybe at different rates in different places, but people are changing to having food, vegetable gardens. They're planting more native, drought-tolerant succulents and shrubs, especially, in a lot of areas in California where it's really dry. Instead of seeing these front lawns, you see these really nice, like, rocky with cactuses and shrubs, like, spread throughout, and it can look really aesthetic. This is the thing, like, we're not just saying that you have to have a big pile of weeds. So we're seeing this change. For example, I looked up cities in California and nearby states are paying residents up to $2 per square foot to remove lawn and replace it with drought-tolerant native landscapes and permeable landscapes. So, you look at these things and there is a change. And there's people doing things where, they just leave kind of the center part of their lawn and let that grow, and they mow around it. You mow walkways. It's a change and it's integration. And like I said, I never said just like everyone should get rid of your lawn and the whole thing, but just about having a more dynamic mosaic, which is more of a natural system. If you go to nature, even in a forest, there's tall old growth forest in one area and another part's been burned recently, so it's more shrubby and grassy. So we just need to mimic a little bit more our natural areas.
And just to add on to that too, there's a lot of cultivars of native species. Some of the most prominent flowers that you're going to see when you go to a home and garden center are going to be cultivars of native species, which just means they've been genetically modified in some way to either have bigger flowers, flower for a longer period of time, be more tolerant in certain areas, but they still function as if they were an unaltered native plant. So just by having that addition to something, you're going to be making a slight difference. It's the same concept as a lot of concepts throughout sustainability, is that you don't have to make a complete change, but if everybody is making small little changes, it's going to make a big difference on a large scale.
Right. There's no need to get overwhelmed by things. Like, go out next spring and take out a small corner of your yard and plant a native shrub, one step at a time, something like that. Just little bits to make a difference and do what we can. And spread the word. Share this podcast. Tell your friends. All right. So we are going to do our little debate round just to stick with the flow. And then we will wrap it up for our second episode.
Let's get to it.
All right. So what do you have for me to say why we shouldn't be getting rid of this lawn grass or these lawns?
Right. I just want you to know, Kirstyn, that this is one of the most difficult things I'm ever going to have to do in my life is to play the part of somebody who really enjoys lawns. I'm going to revert back to my young teenage years when I worked for a landscaping company, and I'm going to dig deep for this one. So, firstly and foremost, lawns, they look good. They are aesthetically pleasing. So, if they look good to me, what's the difference between, a big old pocket full of tall grasses where it looks a little, unkempt and it can house animals that I don't necessarily want in my yard? Why would I go for that? Or is there an alternative?
Right. So this is a complicated piece of this picture where we are so used to the way that things look, and this looks like nature to us. So little by little, we can integrate types of grass. And if you don't like the big unkempt grass, there's a bunch of shrubs that grow you can keep them trimmed at a nice short level. There's some places that are putting moss lawns in, of course, in places in temperate, wet places, and this still looks like a nice green carpet. Working with a landscaping team, trying to find a landscaping team in your area that, maybe supports their use of native plants, and sit down and take a look at the different things you can do. You can make it aesthetically pleasing. And also, I think at the end of the day, we have to change a little bit about what we think is beautiful. And having a little bit of bugs in your front yard is not a bad thing, I promise.
I guess the other thing that I would bring up that I personally see people talk about a lot is if I'm going to have to upkeep all that, I mean, there's more plants, there's more things that I'm going to need to deal with. You mentioned possibly burning things. I don't know how to do that, and it just seems like upkeep with my yard is all I got to do is mow it and fertilize it and put chemicals on it and water it and a few other things. But is the upkeep, it seems so much more simple to have a yard.
Right. Now it does seem a lot more simple just to have one clear little mat of things that you have to take care of. But native plants in general are made for their environment. So they're not going to need nearly as much water, maybe a little bit if there's a drought. They're not going to need as much upkeep. A lot of the grasses are slower growing, right? This is the reason the Kentucky bluegrass, for example, is coming through here. So you're mowing less by using a native grass, you're using less water. And by actually having this kind of mosaic throughout your yard, it's less likely that you're going to have to put a lot of herbicides in there and be out there cutting them down, because this is what it is. The system is quote unquote supposed to be like. So it seems like it's going to be more work, but I promise you it'll be less.
Well, I have to say that you've pretty much convinced me to change my entire outlook on life, and I'm completely against lawns now, and I'm totally for native biodiversity and things like that. Who would have thunk it, too? Because I came into this completely closed-minded, and I was all for lawns at the beginning of this podcast, but since talking to you, I've really, really changed my mind and my entire outlook on life.
Wow, magic words. Thanks, Nicholas. I know that was hard for you. I hope you guys enjoyed that anyway. I know it was a little played up, but it's just good, especially as scientists and as people doing this kind of thing. We have to think about what people are going to say to us, right? And find ways and helpful, creative, and friendly ways to talk to people about their ideas, because getting mad at somebody is never going to help, right? And people sometimes are closed-minded, and that's fine. So you just have to find ways to talk to them about it. But yeah, I think that's about it for our debate round. That's what I had to say about lawn grass in general, about Kentucky bluegrass. And I hope that everybody really enjoyed our second episode and are looking forward to more.
Bye. I didn't have anything else to say.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.